The Kenyan coast heritage was part of what the scholars call the Swahili Confederation. And the Swahili cities were all the way along the East African coast, all the way from Somalia in the north, down through Kenya, Tanzania, as far south as Mozambique. The main cities were Mogadishu on the coast of Somalia. By the way, that usually surprises Somalis to know that their history is in fact connected to Swahili history. Malindi and Mombasa on the coast of Kenya. Mafia and Kilwa off the coast of Tanzania. Sofala off the coast of Mozambique. And Sina, Mozambique inland. Now I'm using terms like Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. Of course, during the time periods that we're talking about, none of these places existed under those names. So who were the people? The more northerly people, say Mogadishu, were described in the records as Berbers, and they are also described as a people of the Sudan, which means a people of the blacks. And then the more southerly people, say Kenya and further south, were called Zenj. That's part of the word Zanzibar. Turkish people will know the name Zenci. Zenj, they are described as extremely black in complexion with tattoo marks cut into their faces. So you either have a black population or an extremely black population. Because of a traveler who visited the coast, Ibn Battuta, we now have another name as well, Sawahil or Swahili. Simply means the coast, those people living on the coast. So essentially we are looking at a Bantu civilization. Bantu is a group of language families. Language groups will include things like Swahili, Zulu, Shona, Kikongo. It's one of that group. But the civilization was cosmopolitan. So they would then be joined by people from Arabia, joined by people from Persia, and most importantly, joined by people from India. And if you visit the East African coast, that Indian presence is still quite significant. Okay, so what type of civilization are we talking about? That's a British colonial era postcard of the city of Lamu. Lamu is kind of Kenya, but it's off the coast. And if it wasn't for the availability of boat transport, you can't actually get to it. So it's kind of isolated. And a close-up view, you can see multi-story buildings and that kind of thing. To the question, but surely Africans could not have built these cities. And believing this, British archaeologist James Kirkman deceived a generation of scholars. And so the result then is those of us telling the history have to kick against James Kirkman's material. Not only that, he's also done a lot of great damage to the historical memory of Kenyans, because they don't realize that his stuff is nonsense. But the nonsense had a major, major impact. And the result was Kirkman misled historians into the error that East African culture was partly, if not entirely, Arab or Persian. And if you speak to people from Kenya, speaking to my guides, taking me around the ruins, nearly all of them believe that. And then what I would challenge, but all the archaeologies only dug up African skeletons. Yeah, but they were the workmen. Well, so that means they built it. Yeah, but they built it under somebody else's control. Where's the somebody else's control skeletons? Do you see? And this is because of James Kirkman. Now, the other piece of evidence that people use is the Swahili language today does indeed have a number of Arabic words mixed up in it, and quite a lot of Arabic words. And this was at one time argued that this demonstrates an important Arab element in the formation of Swahili culture. And ordinarily, linguistics is a powerful tool, and we could use linguistics in this way. However, Dr. John Sutton of the British Institute of East Africa, this is what he says. What is less well understood, however, is that the bulk of these borrowings are not ancient in Swahili, but belong to the last 200 years or so, the period of the new Arabs and the Zanzibari state. So the history and the heritage we're talking about is not the last 200 years. We're talking the periods before that, before the Arab borrowings made their way into Swahili. Now, in the 18th century, well after the great East African culture had declined, Arab sultans did in fact control East Africa. They controlled it from Zanzibar. It became a slave trading zone, etc., etc., etc. But the golden age is well before that. Now let's examine what's in Fort Jesus Museum in Mombasa. They have this, and that is graffito they believe was done by Portuguese people. And you can see African dhows, and some more dhows, and you can see Portuguese ships as well. And it shows that those ships mingled on the Indian Ocean. Also, the museums in Kenya have reconstructed dhows. And there's one of those reconstructed dhows. And you find it's not just dhows, there's multiple types of East African ships that they've got reconstructed. You can see 2 or 3 behind the main one here. So that raised the question, African ships on the Indian Ocean? Yes. These ships could carry 70 tons burden, and these East African ships were on the Indian Ocean. And we know that they go back at least 2,000 years because they're mentioned in a 2,000-year-old book. There was a guidebook that some Greeks had written called The Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. And it mentions that East Africa had sown boats, and it's believed it's the same ones. And what it also means is that many scholars have theorized that East Africa is actually the place of origin of what is today called the Tao. So the Indian Ocean trade. The seasonal monsoon winds shape the trading patterns between East Africa and Asia. In April, the southwest monsoon starts, and it will blow from southwest to northeast. By June or July, it created a strong northerly current that flows up the Somali coast towards India. And once people had got to Oman or India or wherever in the Far East, they would stay there for 6 months. And they would wait for the northeast monsoon, which started in November, and it reached its full strength in January, and it blew from India and the Persian Gulf towards East Africa. And so, if you were an East African mariner, you would be spending 6 months of your year in the East. Does that make sense? And if you were a mariner from Oman, India, those kind of places, you'd be spending 6 months in East Africa. And consequently, ideas and cultural artifacts spread between the two. And an example of this is scholars don't know whether the typical East African front door is East African or Indian. In India, there's something called Gujarat style, and the Gujarat style looks just like East African. And we truly don't know who got it from whom. And it's because of this 6-month stopover. So what were the trading products? The Zenj had a trade in ivory with India and China, with the traffic passing through Oman. The ivory was used to make the handles of daggers in India and royal chairs in China. It was also used to make chess pieces. They were skilled workers in metal. Now, what was this metal? It was in 1978 that the scholars found out what that metal was. They also exported ambergris, which is a perfume, and rhino horn. Let that one sink in. Mic drop. And rhino horn supposedly had medicinal properties. And you can just see the inverted commas on this medicinal. People are looking at me blank. Aphrodisiac. Right? Which is the origin of the word horny. Okay. All right, they traded leopard skins and also timber. Mangrove poles in particular were sold to the building industries of Oman and Persia. Also, did he describe the people? He said, the Moors of Sofala, Moors simply means black folks. The black folks of Sofala clothed themselves from the waist down with cotton and silk cloths, and other cloths they wear over their shoulders like capes and turbans on their heads. Some wear small caps dyed in grain, in checkers, and other woolen cloths in many tints, also camlets and other silks. So that's Sofala, Mozambique. By the time we get the report coming out of Kilwa, the levels of luxury reached was astonishing. They are finely clad in many rich garments of gold and silk and cotton, and the women as well, also with much gold and silver chains and bracelets, which they wear on their legs and arms, and many jeweled earrings in their ears. And then the people from the island cities of Pemba, Mafia, and Zanzibar dressed in the same style as described for Kilwa, with the same associated opulence. Now, Pemba, on a modern map, is the coast of Kenya. All right, now, remember the description of the Moors of Sofala, Mozambique, because that's important. You see, when I visited our Fort Jesus Museum, they had the traditional dress of a Bantu-speaking East African group called the Mijikenda. And those are the Mijikenda and how they're dressed. Now, doesn't that sound just like the description? And the significance of that is this. Scholars now think the people who became the Swahili were originally the Mijikenda. So Mijikenda speakers got to the coast. A coastal culture developed. A lot of people became Muslims. Some continued traditional African religions. They developed a new identity as Swahilis. Do you see? And then you've got the Mijikendas that didn't, that stayed inland. But essentially it's Mijikenda culture. Now, what else was depicted in the Fort Jesus Museum? Right, can you see that's a blacksmith? And can we put him into a context? Did I mention that a certain trading product was discovered in 1978, what it was? And it was some type of iron. It was actually steel. In 1978, 13 ancient iron and steel furnaces were discovered in Tanzania, and these East African smelters made the finest steel produced anywhere in the world between 500 AD and 1850 AD. And it was only after 1850 that their steel technology was surpassed. Did you know East Africans minted their own coins of copper and silver? Did we know this? There's one of them. These coins were issued in the 11th century. They had rhyming couplets on them, praising the king and praising God. And where have these coins been discovered? Well, according to the Daily Mail, that bastion of right-wing conservatism, how 900-year-old African coins found in Australia may finally solve the mystery of who arrived down under first. And let's read it. Coins date back to 6 centuries before Captain Cook. Are we feeling this? And so what this tells us is East African mariners were the documents tell us they were sailing to Oman, they were sailing to India, they were sailing to Java, they were sailing to Indonesia, they were sailing to China, they were sailing to Cambodia, where they established a colony. And we now have the theory that they could well have sailed to the northern fringes of Australia as well. A theory put forward by the Daily Mail. Right, now continuing our theme of metals, This is some reconstructed silver jewelry, which again they believe is in this 13th century context. And are you feeling this? Right, now can you see that they've got the silver bracelets and armbands, and then they've got the local name in Swahili. And the fact that it has a local name in Swahili means it's not an imported concept. You know, if you import someone's concept, you keep their name. So, you know, like, for example, the English word bungalow isn't an English word. Yeah? So, consequently, if you've got an indigenous name for it, it's not an imported concept. We ready for this? Left-hand corner, please. Silver handbag. We enjoying that? Okay, the Portuguese role in Africa. Early in the 16th century, the Portuguese sent their fleets and armies into this region. Dr. Basil Davidson explained this unfortunate episode. It was at Mozambique during his first voyage that da Gama exchanged the first shots. Back again on the coast in 1502, this time with a score of ships from home. Da Gama threatens to burn Kilwa unless its ruler will acknowledge the supremacy of the King of Portugal and pay him yearly tribute in gold. Ravasio does the same thing at Zanzibar and Brava. Meeting resistance, Almeida storms Kilwa and Mombasa, burning and destroying. Saldanha ravages Berbera, Juarez destroys Zela, Da Cunha attacks Brava. So by the time we get to the 16th century, a lot of the East African cities are now up in smoke.